As if pushing her bow into the side of a great mountain, the Henderson landed next at Juneau, the capital of Alaska, which, according to the last census, is the metropolis of the territory. It was early in the morning, and the throng of cheering Alaskans under umbrellas, perched on the buildings and filling the streets, were celebrating the only rainy day President Harding saw in Alaska. A long line of schoolchildren with garlands of fireweed formed the guard of honor. As we drove in automobiles and limousines through the town and up to the governor's residence, located on an eminence commanding a view of the entire harbor, we noticed a large sign beside an old yellow building. It stated grimly, "This is the Capitol building." The structure looked like an old deserted garage, and our government officials' glimpse of it on that rainy day should be sufficient to put through the $250,000 appropriation for a new Alaskan building, which at present the rival city of Anchorage is charged with plotting to hold up. It kept on raining. There is 13 feet of rainfall in southeastern Alaska, and most of the annual quota seemed to be pouring over the president's hearers as he delivered his speech from the porch of the governor's mansion. All day long, while the cabinet ladies went shopping on a souvenir spree and toted home totem poles, walrus ivory, gold nuggets, earrings, and jewelry, their husbands were engaged in official conferences with the citizens. Secretary Wallace was told of the ripe forests where fir, spruce, and birch trees are dying out. Trappers came forward with their plea for protection of fur-bearing animals, of the otter, minks, fox, and beaver, which fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture. In passing, we were amused to note that the patrician seal in the far-off Pribilof Islands, which have paid $3.5 million profits during the past year, belonged to Secretary Hoover in the Department of Commerce, while the great reindeer herds that we were soon to see farther north are controlled by the Bureau of Education. Thus, incongruously, is jurisdiction over Alaska's riches divided up among Washington bureaus. Alaska's greatest virgin asset is her mineral wealth: gold, silver, copper, zinc, antimony, and tungsten. But 70% of her present population is directly involved in the fisheries. Her coal and large areas of platinum are yet to be exploited. After Juneau, Skagway, one-time outfitting place for adventuresome seekers of the Klondike's Golden Fleece. Early in the morning, 484 residents of the town gathered on the wharf where once some 20,000 of gold-thirsty miners had landed. At the picturesque, deserted piers, the Henderson berthed in ghostly stillness. The precipitous wall of the towering cliff, 200 feet high and so near the ship that we could almost touch it, was covered with names and signs, painted by old prospectors and tourists from all over the world. On the wharf, after talking informally to a little group of old miners, the president turned to me and remarked with a quiet smile, "These people amaze me in the way they comprehend. The marvel of Alaska to me is the virility of every individual I see. Of course, environment constantly plays an important part in molding strong characters and strong people. Here, the people have achieved, in this great out-of-doors, a freedom from the restraints of conventionality that helps in the making of strong characters and strong friendships. The longer I live, the more firm is my belief that the greatest possession in the world is dependable friendships." The deserted streets and buildings of Skagway are ghost-like remembrances of a wild past, when prospectors celebrated here before setting out over the Chilkoot Pass as a shortcut to the Yukon and Dawson. There is scarcely a gulch or canyon along the route that has not held in its icy grasp the remains of a gold seeker. Today, a peculiar restfulness broods in this picturesque little town, with its thrilling memories of gambling and adventure. Palatial in their furnishings are the homes built here by wealthy fortune seekers in days gone by. Many residents are firm in the belief that someday Skagway will come into its own again, this time as the tourist gateway to Alaska. The never-dying hope of the prospector prevails among the people. Now came the chill of a 3 days voyage to Seward, across the Gulf of Alaska, the northern crest of the Pacific, that just escapes the Japan current. Here originate the storms and blizzards that sweep the United States and Canada from one end to the other. Even the Texas norther is born in these frigid straits amid floating icebergs. It was on this voyage that we first glimpsed, northward over the black waters, majestic Mount St. Elias, the Muir Glacier, and the lofty ice peaks of the Alaskan Range. Mount St. Elias marks the Canadian boundary. It is the cornerstake of Alaska. From here, the line runs north on the 141st parallel to the Arctic Sea, just missing the Klondike in Canada. 20 miles away from our course lay the Great Malaspina and Bering Glaciers that outline with their icy crags 200 miles of coast. They cover an area larger than all Switzerland. Into the placid waters of Resurrection Bay we sailed at last, with the warm breath of land and vegetation again in our nostrils. Renamed the Harding Gateway in honor of its distinguished visitor, this great waterway, 40 miles square, gives access to the town of Seward, itself named for Secretary Seward of Lincoln's cabinet, who purchased Alaska from the Russian government in 1867 for $7,200,000, or the princely sum of about 2 cents per acre. Seward is the seaward terminus of the 497-mile Alaskan Central Railway, recently completed northward to Fairbanks, and operated by the government as an expensive luxury, at a present loss of $750,000 a year, but with the promise of invaluable service in the development of the interior. It has provided an American route to the Yukon. The cars running directly to the wharf of an all-winter port make it an ideal terminal. This must be a real railroad with a model Pullman train to carry the presidential party, even if it became necessary to get together all the equipment the railroad possessed. And this was done. Nothing was omitted. There were Pullmans, compartment cars, a splendidly equipped diner. The waitresses were young restaurant queens who did volunteer duty for the trip. The porters' uniforms were quite in keeping with the volunteer porters themselves, underneath whose jackets beat the hearts of barber, shopkeeper, and trapper. One wore a baseball cap, another a naval cap, but the magic word porter was emblazoned on each, and Pullman dignity at the car step was fully maintained. At the head of the train, waiting to pull us over the mountain passes to Fairbanks, was Uncle Sam's old locomotive 618 that I remembered seeing in Panama years ago, during the construction of the canal. Our long journey toward the Arctic Circle started over the right-of-way of the first railroad built in Alaska. 72 miles of this line were constructed by the old Alaska Central many years ago, and later practically abandoned. Soon we were traveling past monster glaciers that gleamed like innumerable gems in their mountain settings. Most of the ice packed deeply in these valleys has been there for thousands of years since the last glacial period. The dirt washed down upon them from the ridges made giant wagon tracks across their dazzling surfaces. No less than 18 impressive mountain waterfalls glistening in the sunlight caught our eyes, already almost jaded with Alaska's bewildering beauties. On their Dodge Speeder, a rail automobile used in construction work, President and Mrs. Harding enjoyed the splendors of a continent's mountain ranges heaped together in wild majesty. Pulling over loops and through tunnels, tier upon tier, winding about like a figure eight, the train swept through the most massive snow sheds in the world, engineering triumphs that have stood up under avalanches of snow and ice which fall on their flat roofs. The photographers threw up their hands in despair. The beauties here could never be caught by the camera. The region was a Yosemite and a Yellowstone combined, with the glittering majesty of snowy peaks and ice-filled canyons thrown in. The stations along the route are referred to as Mile 13 and Mile 79. The first stop was called The Tunnel, Mile 59, and here a bountiful midday meal was served in the construction camp. Even the President and Mrs. Harding ate from tin plates and drank from tin cups. Winding around a great mountain, the train circled the shores of historic Turnabout Inlet, so named by the Indians because of the ceaseless rush of the tide sweeping in from Cook Inlet, the roundabout sea route to the town of Anchorage, which we were approaching by the railroad shortcut. It was 11 o'clock in the evening when the train whistled for Anchorage, but the skies were as bright as day in this country of almost perpetual summer light. Even at this late hour, the people flocked out from their little bungalow homes, surrounded by luxuriant vegetable and flower gardens, and waited for a presidential speech. In that uncanny yellow sheen of mingled dusk and dawn, the president grimly remarked, "I don't know whether to address you people by wishing you good evening or good morning." The city of Anchorage is only 9 years old, a government-created municipality with the distinctive spirit of a western boomtown and inhabited by hustlers. It is located upon a tableland above the harbor. There are wide paved streets, waterworks, and electric lights. Uncle Sam sold over $1 million worth of lots on the town site. Anchorage has already secured the removal of the land office from Juneau, and now is ambitious to become the capital city of Alaska. Some of us still carried copies of the Juneau newspaper in which an advertising merchant had wished the drenched presidential party good luck on the trip, adding the pious afterthought, "We hope it will also rain in Anchorage." But it did not rain in Anchorage. President Harding enjoyed a sunny drive through the streets to see the little homes in what the residents proudly referred to as the suburbs. An Admiral Line steamer at her wharf, just leaving for Seattle, waited so that all the passengers might see the president as he inspected the government-built docks. They can be used for only 5 summer months, but cargoes for Fairbanks and interior Alaska landed here in Anchorage during that period, save the 114-mile expense of rail haulage and heavy grades over the mountains from Seward. The whistle of Engine 618 called, and we boarded our Pullman train for the Arctic. But there was not much sleep for the president or any of his party that night. Before we had fairly left Anchorage, there came into view that magnificent tower of heaven, Mount McKinley, 20,464 feet, over a mile higher than Pikes Peak, and the highest point of land on our western hemisphere. A silver light overspread land and water directly toward the north. Above it gleamed a sea of gold, with beautiful clouds outlined upon it, as if the islands below had been lifted into this transcendent glow. And from this golden sea, 150 miles and more away, towered the imperial pile, defying artists, camera, and pen alike. At this distance, there seemed to be no ragged edges, no rugged peaks, no beetling cliffs. All was mellow in outline, soft contours robed in snowy white. Under the yellow tinge of Alaska's sunny midnight, Mount McKinley seemed to melt into the heavens. On puffed the special train of 11 coaches, up the Susitna River through the towering Talkeetna Mountains and over high iron bridges, which spanned almost bottomless canyons. A detour was made over the branch line to the coal mines at Chickaloon. Here were the wartime naval mines, which once hoped to rival the Pocahontas coalfields, but which now lie abandoned, a $1 million failure, for the coal found there could not be used, even after the installation of a $1 a ton coal washing plant. All the people have gone. The houses with tennis courts provided for the miners are now deserted, and the place is in the hands of caretakers. It was a mournful procession that came down the long steps after viewing Uncle Sam's deserted village. But there was comfort in the knowledge that elsewhere in Alaska lie great fields of really valuable coal. Back to the main line at Matanuska, the train passed through an agricultural area where garden truck for the miners is raised. Livestock on the farms apparently is scarce. There are 30 times as many dogs as pigs in Alaska, 17,000 to be exact. And yet, mysteriously, everybody has bacon for breakfast. The figures on livestock and agriculture in all Alaska would not equal a small county in Iowa, yet the fertility of the soil is phenomenal. Mrs. Florence Hoffman, wife of a deputy U.S. Marshal, brought aboard luscious strawberries picked that morning. I took 2 boxes to the president, who marveled at the flavor of these near-Arctic berries as he ate them for breakfast without waiting to have them stemmed. The daylight brightened as we passed through this region of farms. The chicken coops, we noticed, were covered with blankets to produce an artificial night and send the hens to roost. A common report around Matanuska is that the chickens here double their laying capacity, laying 2 eggs every 24 hours. At a station called Montana, or Milepost 209, we stopped at a large black fox farm. Out from their little kennels behind wire netting flocked baby foxes and their mothers, brothers, and sisters to eye us craftily. Frequently, these baby foxes are nursed by the mother cats of the household until they are a few weeks old. Thereafter, it is unwise to leave them with their foster mother, for the sly baby foxes will turn on the one who fed them and kill her. The foxes, fed on inexpensive foods such as fish, are killed in the fall and shipped to fur centers, the value of the pelts ranging from $30 to $200. A large percentage of all the black fox furs now sold is said to come from these foxes reared on ranches which handle 50 to 100 fox. There are over 2,000 fox on these farms, constituting a growing portion of the Alaskan fur industry, which yields an annual revenue of over $1 million. This figure, by the way, does not include the seal of the Pribilof Islands, where there are herds of 525,000 seals, and only surplus males are taken. The annual revenue for Uncle Sam from seal is about $3.5 million. Dinner served at Curry, the railroad division point, was a 7-course table d'hôte that had all the niceties of a banquet at the Waldorf. The only thing missing was fresh milk. By this time, however, we had cultivated a condensed milk appetite. All of the regular passenger trains remain overnight at Curry. Our train was an exception, for it pushed on to Broad Pass that night. This is near the summit of the Alaskan Range, and we were parked there for the night in our sleeping cars. Broad Pass is the summit of the Alaskan Rocky Mountains, and is the lowest railway pass over the Rockies. The elevation is only 2,300 feet, while the lowest in the United States is 7,000 feet. The daylight view of Mount McKinley, now 60 miles away, furnished another hour of wonder. The train took us through grazing lands of reindeer, which are under the supervision of the Bureau of Education, because this Bureau of the Interior Department instructs the natives in reindeer breeding. As early as 1921, over $100,000 worth of reindeer meat was sold in the United States. The range is sufficient for 10 million of these animals, which may someday constitute a new meat supply for all North America. Passing up Windy River, we noticed telegraph wires stretching on 3-legged poles, arranged together after the manner of an Indian teepee. This structure is necessary because the wind sweeping across the Great Plains would blow down any ordinary pole placed in the ground, and because of the difficulty of keeping a pole in the ground that is here frozen for 200 feet below the surface. Mount McKinley National Park at last. 3,000 square miles of untouched nature and the world's unsurpassed wild game preserve. Here I met Harry Karstens, the guardian of this domain, with 2 rangers as assistants. This is Uncle Sam's largest national park, and Karstens is pleading for a modest appropriation for roads. It was Harry Karstens who first scaled Mount McKinley and made good on Dr. Cook's pretensions. He was 52 days making the ascent. He carried with him silk tents to sleep in and homemade pemmican of moose meat and pork. At times, his party waited for days in isolation high above the clouds, waiting for storms to pass. The same locomotive, number 618, was used on the entire trip to Fairbanks and return, although at one point going over the mountains it broke down under the strain and had to pull one section of the train across and then return for the other. President Harding climbed into the cab at Healy and pulled the throttle like an old-timer, and kept his eyes on the air. Mrs. Harding sat on the fireman's seat opposite, and old 618 rolled and rocked over the rails at a lively pace. But the president's stop was a small-scale sample of an earthquake. The president greeted the Huskies at Kobe, terminus of the Overland Dog Team mail train to the Kuskokwim and Iditarod Gold District, which has replaced the famous Rainy Pass route. He was warned not to pat these wolf-like dogs on the head, for while very faithful, they are not affectionate and cannot even be fed from the hand. A good husky leader dog is well worth some $300 and will obey none other than his master. The dog teams have been known to travel 60 miles a day in the Derby dog races from Nome to Fairbanks. The farmers use the dogs with small wagons in summer, as well as to pull sleds in winter, and keep them in dog barns, characteristic little buildings that we noticed all along the way. Now we were getting into the Yukon district, and we stopped at Nenana on the Tanana River, near its juncture with the mighty Yukon that flows onward to Bering Sea. At Nenana, the Golden Spike was driven by President Harding, marking the completion of the Alaska Railroad to standard gauge from the narrow gauge that had previously been operated to Fairbanks, about 30 miles away. 1/3 of the coal used on Alaska railroads comes from the Nenana River Valley. The coal is also marketed along the Alaskan coast from Ketchikan to Kodiak, the ancient Russian capital of Alaska. The town of Nenana is situated in the center of an ambitious agricultural region. One enterprising American had brought a harvester up here, but found it impossible to get the machine to his farm because of the lack of roads. Blueberries grow in wild profusion, and blueberry pies are the popular favorite in the lunchrooms. These Alaskan lunchrooms, by the way, are distinctive. The high stools at the counters are provided with restful rocking chair backs, and people congregate there, making the place restaurant, club, and hotel lobby combined. Farthest north on steel rails. The train was entering Fairbanks in the glow of a sunset that lingered far on toward midnight. The city is located on both sides of the Chena River, and the main street overlooks the log wharves, once lined with Yukon riverboats, now deserted since the railroad arrived. Old Seoul seemed to sit like a huge bowl on the horizon, just moving over a bit every 24 hours. The moon was not to be crowded out, and here was the spectacle of the sun shining amicably with the moon in the same night sky. The country roundabout is rough and wildly picturesque. No towering mountains near at hand, a country of the Alaska plains. Hereabout are the creeks or valleys from which have been taken millions in nuggets and gold dust. The old-time terminal and deserted narrow-gauge engines recalled the stirring days when gold dust, weighed on a scale, was the currency that passed over the counter or bar. Immense bouquets of all kinds of flowers were given to every member of the party, and luscious red tomatoes, pride of the region, were served us at a neighboring farm, while belles of the town stood by with salt cellars to season them for us. A quick, dusty drive was made to the Agricultural and Mining College, the farthest north educational institution in the world. The first class of this college, the class of 1923, consisted of one sturdy lad, John Stanley Sexton. There are about 50 students now, and all provided with fine classrooms and libraries. Already they have filled one room with rare mining and agricultural specimens from all parts of Alaska. The Alaska Railroad opens up 4,000 miles of interior navigable river routes, and makes a route direct to Nome and St. Michael down the river as well as to Dawson and the Land of Gold up the river. Fairbanks, that harbored perhaps 20,000 people in gold rush days, now has homes for 1,500. The houses are cozy, flower-decked log bungalows, the chinks often filled with moss and mud in lieu of plaster. Idleness here is a crime. There is always something to do, and common labor gets 75 cents an hour. There are no servants in Fairbanks. Everybody does his own work, or the neighbors drop in to help when an emergency arises. In fact, in Alaska, there are no poor, no mendicants begging by the wayside. There is no class distinction. No one is questioned concerning his past or why he has come to Alaska. Here, one has a real comprehension of the Empire of Alaska, which embraces more land than all of England, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland combined. The potato yield is 300 bushels to an acre. Turnips, carrots, and sugar beets flourish without the aid of commercial fertilizer. Wheat yields 20 to 25 bushels an acre. Red-topped and yellow-flowered alfalfa grow abundantly. The daylight night was chilly, but the sun still smiled on the greening crops. Farms in this great interior Alaska are located on the sunny side of the slopes only. The ground is frozen to a great depth, but thaws out year by year as it is cultivated. Large fields of wheat and barley and clover were rapidly approaching the harvest days. Because of its rapid growth, hay must be cut frequently to retain its succulence. Alaskans take their wonderful flowers as a matter of course. The territory grows more flowers per capita than does the USA. I remember especially the petunias and the Alaskan rose, which is much larger than our old-fashioned wild rose, but has the same rich color and perfume. It was midnight when we left the farm to attend a banquet given at the model lunchroom on Main Street. The lunch counters were already filled, for many miners had mushed in from miles around to meet the president. Ham and eggs cost $1 a plate, but the portion would feed a family. Pennies, we had found, are never used and seldom a dime. Practically everything costs a quarter, even a shoe shine or newspaper. After more tomatoes and club sandwiches that would have made Oscar of the Waldorf envious, the party started on a tour of the old restricted district, now deserted, a ghostly memory of the wild days when the demimonde queens reigned. There were back streets and secret passages, where victims might be hustled out of this carnival of crime, dead or alive, without fear of detection. Wandering back, we ran against the fire hydrants. There were no lampposts to collide with, but these hydrants were astonishing. They were encased in boxes, with steam pipes operating even in the summer days, for remember, Fairbanks is perched upon frozen ground. Around and around the streets we wandered all night, looking to each other like ghosts in the unreal light of a motion picture studio. We could not think it was night here. The only realistic thing was the continuous crow of the chickens that lasted until morning. The snug little log bungalows in Fairbanks appealed greatly to President Harding. One could imagine them in the long winter nights when the families snuggle about their stoves. In each house there are porthole ventilators. During the winters, the children watch the sun rise through the window and shout with glee as old Sol makes his arc from one telephone pole to the next, counting that a day's work. The sheen on the snow and the glow of the aurora borealis prevent anything like inky darkness, and there is scarcely a day when the children cannot be bundled up and rolled out in the snow for play and exercise in the long 6 months winter night. The president had been greeted that day in the ballpark at 10 a.m., when the sun is hottest. The ball games in Fairbanks usually are played at the convenient hour of midnight. It is cooler at that time, and there is no glare of the sun to impair the vision of the players. But despite the daytime heat, the grandstand that morning was filled, and the president made one of the happiest addresses of his tour. Chairman Hurley submitted each request that had been filed to a vote of the people assembled. It was like the old forum or town hall days, as the citizens responded viva voce to every plan and suggestion made by the president. In all the history of the Republic, no president was ever actually closer to his people in executive deliberation than was Warren G. Harding on that day. The great park was rimmed with automobiles, some of whose owners had driven 300 miles. Every fourth man in Fairbanks possesses an automobile. Distances mean little in Alaska. There are so many of them. They don't live by timetables, calendars, or 90-day notes. Everything, as in South America, is counted by seasons, and a 1,000-mile trip is a holiday jaunt over the trail, because time doesn't count. Fairbanks has a live daily newspaper with cable news dispatches. President Harding set type in the office and helped make up the forms, but said he couldn't tell whether he was getting out a morning or an evening paper. The Fairbanks show windows are not so far behind those on Fifth Avenue. Alaskan women in summertime wear white lawn dresses, and the fashions have followed the flag up here to the edge of the Arctic. Many newsstands appropriate big show windows. People read more newspapers and books per capita in Alaska during the winter months than do the people of any state in the Union. In the partially completed Hotel Nordale, the only hotel in Alaska where the president spent the night, he relaxed in the midst of the almost continuous hours of work in speaking and official business. He had been absorbing and acquiring new information as had no other person in the party. Fairbanks appears a seemly place to take a reckoning, he mused as he filled his pipe. We are turning southward again. Let's go over the situation. Alaska, I have come to see, is our great pioneer reserve, and these are the right people here now to meet its problems by a slow but permanent development. The old notion of capitalists swooping down on Alaska to make their pile and get out has passed. It is now a question of stayers, men who are equal to the struggle. Let Alaska be for real Alaskans. The farms we have seen prove what can be done, but there must be more markets and more people. The country is a great food reserve. Altogether, I am most hopeful of Alaska and its future, but let there be no reckless sacrifice of resources with quick profits. While the products of the fisheries in Alaska are greater than the wealth of the mines, there is danger of exhausting the supply. More restrictions would seem to be necessary. Forest conservation, frankly, I see now is not too drastic, as I find no complaints among the people here against holding firm for the utilization of timberlands upon a systematic basis. Coal is being mined satisfactorily. Perhaps we need some changes, but the coal is unlimited. Alaskan coal will come into its own under the natural economic laws. The oil development should be encouraged, but to develop these oil resources of the North will require millions of private capital under the lure of returns, as reflected in the California and Mexican fields. The great problem now is the lack of transportation. Agriculture in Alaska is relative to other development, but needs liberal encouragement. If fisheries, forests, and mines are looted, there is no hope for farms, but a permanent, well-rounded policy of substantial development will make agriculture a factor in the dreams of statehood. This railroad that we have just come over is a triumph of American skill and perseverance against obstacles. We must honor the men who have given us this splendid achievement. If the world only knew of this gorgeous scenic route through the superlative grandeur of her scenery, Alaska could count on a substantial revenue from tourists who are certain to come and carry the news to the far corners of the world of this wonderland of the earth. It is our extreme frontier, and Alaska is on its way to an expansion of fur products, for fur trade in Alaska is like unto cotton in Alabama and corn to the Midwest. With rational generosity, shortening the distance between Alaska and Washington, working with these people, we will have in Alaska the making of a great state. Thus, before President Harding went to bed that night, I heard expounded the policy of sane development of our frontier empire that the president had already evolved from his observations, that he later sketched in his Seattle speech, and that he would have urged upon the nation had not the great calamity of San Francisco put a tragic stop to all his labors.